Right now, the US is a car driving into a wall with our foot all the way down on the gas. The federal administration is proposing a $7 trillion budget next year. We have $33 trillion of national debt. That number has swelled since COVID and in the years following due to the launch of new programs and other stimulatory effects, spending by the federal government. And the problem with having too high of a national debt relative to national GDP is the way that a government pays their debt is by taxing their economy, taxing their GDP. And there's a natural limit to how much economically you can actually tax the economy. Once you increase taxes too high, investment declines. Once you tax investments too high on individuals, people leave. We saw this with the launch of the wealth tax in France. There's an attrition of capital, a hiding of capital. All of these factors aren't necessarily about people being bad and doing bad things. They're just natural economic forces that we've seen play out many times in the past. So there's a certain natural limit to how much debt government can actually take on.
Do we have a sense of what that limit is?
Some people would argue it's somewhere between 100 and 150, maybe up to 200% of GDP, but 100 and 150% is really where things are sustainable. Now, the US is a very unique outlier in, the history of global economies. But there has been a set of studies, and Ray Dalio kind of captured a bunch of data together in his book about the changing world order and the economic cycles that we've seen historically. 6 times in the last 500 years, we've seen these sorts of things. So I think that's the thing that makes me worried is at some point, spending at the federal level gets so high and debt levels get so high that it's really hard to come back from that money printing that's needed to support paying that interest and paying that debt. And right now, inflation is being fueled by the stimulatory effects of these programs. And because things are inflating, the government feels like there is a need to help make things easier for people. So they put more money and launch more programs to try and reduce inflation. And in doing so, they increase inflation. And then as inflation goes up, the interest rates on the debt have to go up. When the interest rates on the debt go up, it becomes harder to pay down the debt. And so our $33 trillion of debt, a good 50% of it is getting refinanced now, where the interest rate moves from an average of about 3% to 5%. And when that happens, 2% increase in interest on $15 trillion, that's another $300 billion of interest payments a year. And this year, we're already paying $1 trillion just in interest on the debt that the federal government owes to its bondholders, to the people that own treasuries. So we're getting to a point that it becomes really difficult to actually stop the spending, pay the interest, and or reduce the debt levels. And that's how these spirals kind of have played out historically. And every time it's played out, whether it was the Dutch or the English or, whomever you want to kind of look to, there was always this, it can't happen here. This is the leading global economy. This is the reserve currency of the world. It's not going to happen here. And every time the natural forces of arithmetic played out, that's why I'm so worried. I think we are fundamentally driven by this concept that I think is best phrased as desire. It doesn't go away. Humans never stop wanting. The natural condition of a human is to see something that we don't have, and then create an objective of, I want to have that thing I don't have. When I then have that thing, I no longer feel like I'm unmotivated. I now look for, and I naturally see the next thing. I think this is what made humans evolutionarily successful. We were able to then scout out the next meal, scout out the bigger building, scout out the better cave, and it allowed us as a species to continuously progress, expand our population, and succeed and thrive on this planet. But the unfortunate reality is that tuning, that biological tuning, has this effect where no one is ever actually fully satisfied with the things they have. Satisfaction comes from the change in the things that you have, the delta. And the delta from year to year is what drives happiness. And in a voting system, in a political system, it drives how people vote. That if my income isn't going up by 10% per year, I am unsatisfied. And there's a lot of good behavioral social studies on this. There was a study done years ago, which I think has been disproven since, but it does a good job, I think, of explaining this, which is up to a certain limit of income, people are unhappy and they get happier with more and more income. After that limit of income, where all of your basic needs are met with respect to being able to pay for your food, your housing, medical, and take care of your family, your income is no longer your predictor of happiness. Your change in income is your predictor of happiness. So if we start with that premise of human behavior, the federal government in the United States now has an incredible role in supporting a lot of people through active programs that pump money into businesses, so the government is a customer of many businesses, or employing many people that end up working directly for the government or under government programs. I tried to pull together all this data a couple months ago, but something north of 30 or 40% of the US working force is touched by the government as a customer of their business, the primary customer of their business, or as the employer of those individuals. So the government has been a big driving force for economic growth in the United States over the last 250 years. But we're now reaching a point where in order to sustain that system, where people have their income and their livelihoods improved year after year because of government intervention and government policy, it's no longer kind of sustainable. A lot of people in the United States are dependent on Social Security and the income that comes from Social Security. That program on its own is forecast to go bankrupt in 2033, Wow. Independent of a lot of the issues we're dealing with in the debt and spending and the rest of the government. The Medicare program, the costs continue to climb, continue to mount, and a lot of people are dependent on that program for their healthcare needs. Those are two federal programs, a very large percentage of federal spending. How do you get voters, where there are tens of millions of people that are dependent on those programs, to vote to reduce those benefits? They simply won't. And it's why neither Democrats nor Republicans, and I'm not advocating for it at all. I'm not advocating for reducing those programs. I'm just pointing out the simple reality of how a democracy will work in this circumstance, which is those individuals don't want to give up those benefits. They don't want to give up that income. They don't want to give up that medical care. It was promised to them. They invested in those programs for decades. But the government and the way that the system has been set up has now made it, very difficult because we have to take on more debt to support those programs. And then we have a lot of other stimulatory programs, a lot of other systems where the government is the customer of businesses. They are spending money to buy stuff from those businesses. Medicare is a good example. They buy a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. The system is challenged because if I'm the government, what's my incentive to negotiate for a lower price? I can go to Congress and get a bigger budget next year. Everyone in the system is built to make more money for themselves. So next year, I want to have a bigger budget. I want to be able to spend more. I want to grow my organization. No one ever leads an organization and says, I want to shrink this organization. I want to cut it by 50%. That's my goal. Let's shrink the organization that I'm leading. The natural incentive is to grow. So I think that there's a lot of tension in the way that the system has evolved, that both the internal organizations are designed to grow and the voters are not going to give stuff up that they've gotten. And I always think about in my junior high, there was a kid who ran for president, and he said, I'm going to make all the vending machines free. That was his platform. It was so smart. And everyone voted for him. Of course I'm going to vote for the guy that tells me I'm going to get the vending machines are going to be free. I don't have to pay for my chips and soda anymore. That's how people get elected in a democracy. They go to the voters and they say, here's what I'm going to give you. They don't say, here's what I'm going to cut back for the survival of the union over the next 50. That doesn't sell. What sells is I'm going to increase Medicare benefits. I'm going to improve Social Security. I'm going to launch new programs to support your community. I'm going to build stuff. I'm going to create new jobs. Those are the things that voters want to hear. And so there's this demand from the voters for more stuff. So I would argue that the politicians aren't necessarily even the cause of the problem. I think that they're more a symptom of the system that is set up to operate this way. Naturally evolves to this point that the voters every year want more stuff. And if they're not getting more stuff because the economy isn't naturally growing and their incomes aren't growing, they turn and look to the government to solve those problems. And then the government has to grow. Then they put people in place who stand up and say, I'll give you all that stuff. And they're like, okay, great. You're the guy. You're the gal. You go do that. We vote for you. And I think that's why it's so hard to back away from this.
How money printing fits into this?
If you look at the balance sheet of the Fed, the balance of the treasuries that they hold, I think it's about $8 trillion now. The central bank of the United States is the Federal Reserve. The federal government needs money to pay its bills, all the stuff that it's spending money on. And the way that the federal government does that is they tax businesses and citizens, and that tax allows them to pay their bills, but we spend more than we make. So the federal government has to issue bonds. These are promises to pay in the future. And those bonds are bought by people like you and I. It's bought by foreign governments, China, Saudis. A lot of individuals and companies around the world like to hold U.S. Treasury bonds. Right now, Treasury bonds are a great yield. You can get 5% interest by buying U.S. Treasuries, and the federal government guarantees they're going to give it to you. That's the word of the U.S. Treasury, which is historically been considered a risk-free asset. And then they take those Treasuries and they get cash, and then they take that cash and they pay their bills. One of the buyers of treasuries is the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, which is overseen by Congress, but is separate, doesn't actually report up to the president. The Federal Reserve has this ability to buy treasuries and issue money, issue cash that they don't have, right? So the Federal Reserve has this ability to print the US dollar. Historically, they've been buyers of treasuries, supporting the market for the federal government to be able to issue debt to pay their bills. And then as more money comes into the system from the Federal Reserve, which is effectively created out of nothing, that money flows its way into the economy. And if you have, for example, 30 trillion US dollars floating around versus 10 trillion US dollars floating around, things are going to inflate because there's more dollars to spend on stuff and the cost of things will naturally go up. That's a super, super duper simplified way of kind of explaining the system. So the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, issues money almost on a loan basis to banks. and buys treasuries with the expectation that at some point the US government's going to pay them back. So that's the economic relationship between the central bank and the federal government. And the way that money then finds its way into the system, the federal government can't just print the money, the central bank can, and then those treasuries get held by our central bank, and that money finds its way into the system. So at some point, you can look at the total amount of debt of the federal government and think like any household, how much debt can you afford each month? And at what point are you going to go broke? That's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it is that in order to overcome that, there's going to be a lot of money printing because the Federal Reserve can just buy all those bonds and issue that money. And then that money just finds its way into the system. So there's a question at which point there's too many dollars that get printed.
This is the part that people don't understand.
Yeah.
So there's a magic thing that happens when the money is made up out of thin air, completely fake, untethered to anything. It is literally just entry into a database that they decide to click clack, and now that money technically exists. Why isn't that awesome? We can just make more money, just keep making more money, make the budget bigger every year.
Let's say that you and I have $50 each, and we're the only people with money. And there's a guy over here selling sodas. We know we can buy those sodas now, and he's only got 4 sodas to sell. We really want to buy all the sodas, so we eventually end up paying $25 each for a soda. Okay, there's 4 sodas, $50 each. Suddenly, some guy shows up with another $100. Let's say the other guy shows up with $200. Now he's going to start competing for those sodas. And the guy that's selling those 4 sodas is like, hey guys, suddenly the price is $75 a soda because there's more people that want sodas and there's more cash available. So that's how the price of sodas inflated. That's what happens when there's more money that floods into the system, is that the purchasing power of the existing dollars in the system goes down because there's now more money competing for some number of assets or services that are being sold. So the price of assets and the price of services goes up and the value of the dollars goes down, which means that the value of your savings, the value of the stuff you own goes down. And this is particularly true for the majority of Americans who are not big asset holders, right? They only have more than half of Americans can't pull together $1,000 for an emergency. If the value of dollars go down and their incomes aren't going up, they're deeply hurt by that. People that own a lot of stuff can take their assets and they can buy inflation-hedged securities or inflation-hedged assets. Like you could go buy timberland, you could buy gold, or you could buy Bitcoin, which a lot of people argue is a great inflation hedge now. Those assets, because they're fixed in supply, they will go up in dollar-denominated terms. Wealthy people can handle inflation. The majority of other people cannot. And inflation really hurts the economic growth because now people spend less, they have less money to spend, businesses shrink and things go bankrupt. So inflationary cycles are very damaging to economic cycles.
I'll make a statement. You tell me if you think this is fair. Money printing is legalized theft from the government. They are stealing not your dollars, because you're going to have the same amount of dollars in the bank, but they are knowingly stealing your purchasing power, which is the same, in effect, as just taking money from you.
Yes. What I will change about your statement is I will expand the definition of government to the people that were voted into government by the people that voted. And this is what's so important to understand.